Hello, everyone. This is a webinar from the Center for Future Consciousness. And I'm Tom Lombardo, the director of the Center for Future Consciousness. And as Terry mentioned, we have a newsletter, Future Consciousness Insights. And we also have a video school for the Center for Future Consciousness. And all of the previous webinars in this series are available on the video school. The first few are for free, but all of them are up there. So if you ever want to go back and look at them, including the slides, they're all there and they're all available for you to see. And here's the books I've published on future studies, the study of consciousness, psychology, and wisdom. And up there are 3 books on science fiction, which I will come to and highlight a bit more in a moment. And I should mention 2 things about the display you have up on the screen. There's a couple more new ones that are coming very soon, which I will tell you about during a future webinar, but a couple more are coming. And because of that, we had scheduled the next webinar in 2 weeks on April 30th, part 2 of today. But I wanted to get those new books out. And because of that, I'm going to postpone the next half of this webinar probably for 2 weeks. I'll send you a notification on it, but instead of being on April the 30th, they're probably going to postpone it till the end of the 2nd week of May, because I want to finish those books up right now. But in case you have paid, I think I mentioned this, we'll make sure that you get credit for it when we do the next one, the middle of May. Aside from those books which are published up there, you can look at another book that I did together with Victor Madi, that is on a dialogue of science fiction, how to achieve planetary wisdom through future consciousness, up on Victor's Alternative Planetary Futures Institute website. And that's online for anybody to read if they're interested. And I should mention, as I always do, that the mission of the Center for Future Consciousness is to advance the purposeful evolution of humanity through the heightening of future consciousness and wisdom and the inspirational, mythic, and cosmic power of science fiction. Now, the webinar series that I'm doing, The Evolution of Science Fiction, is based on a series of books that I have been writing, Science Fiction, The Evolutionary Mythology of the Future. The 3 images that are up on the screen right now, those 3 books have already been published, Prometheus to the Martians, The Time Machine to Metropolis, and Superman to Star Maker. And webinars on all 3 of those are available on the video school. Volume 4, projected volume 4, the Golden Age to the Silver Age, I did webinars on that back a bit ago, and those are available, the webinars, to view. The book has yet to be completed. Right now, we are actually up to volume 5 in the webinar series, The New Wave, Star Wars, and Cyberpunk. I did the New Wave webinars back a bit ago, and today we're going to be doing the period of Star Wars and science fiction cinema, and we'll wrap it up with the second half, which will be on cyberpunk science fiction. So the webinars are aligning up with the books, and in case you haven't bought or read any of the volumes that are up there, I'm definitely looking for people who would be interested in writing reviews for Amazon in any of those books. So just to encourage you, aside from being interested in attending the webinars and maybe looking at the old webinars, go on and buy the books and write a review for Amazon. I'd be definitely appreciative of that. Now, today we're up to actually module 15 in this series, Star Wars through Cyberpunk, How Science Fiction Conquered the World. And the images I have up there are of Thomas Disch, who we talked about last time under the New Wave Science Fiction, and his book, The Dreams Our Stuff is Made Of. And I'm going to talk in a little bit of depth on that book and its significance, because the expression how science fiction conquered the world, I took from Thomas Disch. You'll notice that's the subtitle of his book, The Dreams Our Stuff is Made Of. And we're going to be covering the period of approximately 1977, when the first Star Wars came up, through the end of the 1980s, with the flourishing of cyberpunk science fiction, say, for example, through Neuromancer by William Gibson and Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash, and Rudy Rucker's series of novels, one of them being Software. The total series is referred to as the Ware tetralogy, and we will eventually get to that in the part 2 of this. But we're covering approximately a 13-year period, and we're going to be highlighting in particular in the first half of this webinar, science fiction cinema. Now, I normally go back and just do a very quick review of the previous webinar. And the previous webinars I did were on New Wave science fiction. And New Wave science fiction was science fiction that emerged in the mid to late 60s into the 1970s. And it was intended to be a new approach to science fiction that reflected the emerging new pop culture of the hippies of the middle to late 60s and the counterculture of that time. And it fed into that cultural movement, contributing into it. That is, New Wave science fiction writers felt as if they were expressing a new way of thinking about human society, human culture, human values, and they were going to do a transformative type of process with science fiction and moving science fiction toward a new perspective on the future. And I'm going to come back to that point, because even though New Wave science fiction attempted to present a new set of fictional narratives on the future and both reflect and impact popular culture, how successful they were at that is a question. Because when we come to the late 1970s, we do find science fiction having a tremendous impact on popular culture, way beyond anything New Wave science fiction ever achieved. But it did it in a different kind of way than perhaps was anticipated. But during the New Wave era, we had lots of interesting writers: Michael Moorcock, J.G. Ballard, Brian Aldiss, Norman Spinrad, Harlan Ellison, Roger Zelazny, Philip Jose Farmer, Chip Delaney, Robert Silverberg, Thomas Disch, who was a science fiction writer to begin with. And we talked about all of those individuals. Kurt Vonnegut, who was the most popular of the New Wave writers within popular culture, general culture. John Brunner's and the Stand on Zanzibar novel, which I thought was the best novel to emerge out of the New Wave. Old Wave writers during the New Wave who wrote hard science fiction, and Joel Haldeman's very famous and fantastic novel of future war, The Forever War, Russian science fiction, the Strugatsky brothers, and other New Wave writers like David Gerrold with The Man Who Folded Himself. We talked about cinema during that period, and in particular, I highlighted the emergence of women science fiction writers, Anne McCaffrey, Ursula Gwen, Joanna Russ, James Tiptree Jr., and others. Because one of the big things about the new wave was that women acquired a much stronger voice in science fiction than ever before. So that's sort of just a brief overview of that period and what we talked about in the last webinar. Now, moving into module 15. At the beginning here, I have an image up there which some people may recognize, and it's an image from the 1980s version of Tron. And Tron, I thought, was one of the more significant science fiction movies of the period we're going to be discussing, because it did blend in a good deal of special effects, virtual reality, had a cyberpunk overtone to it, and it embodied and represented a new kind of science fiction movie which was emerging in the 1980s. And if you haven't seen the original Tron, which I think is much better than the one they did later on, I would definitely recommend going back and watching it, because it is a very fascinating movie visually, and they, as I mentioned, there are several cyberpunk elements to it. But what we're going to do today is, how did science fiction conquer the world? What does that mean? Thomas Disch, the dreams our stuff are made of. And we're going to talk about Star Wars and space opera epical blockbusters and the emergence of visual spectacularism in science fiction cinema, and lots of other blockbuster movie series in science fiction. And I'll go into a good deal of depth on the kind of cinema that emerged during that 12-year period. And a lot of these movies I'm sure you have seen, and I'm sure you have your favorites on them. And I will tell you what my two favorites were during that 12 or 13-year period where science fiction cinema became an extremely powerful and influential dimension of popular culture. We'll talk about science fiction TV during that period and the ongoing evolution of the science fiction community and new science fiction awards. And I'm going to go in a little bit depth into the Hugo Awards and talk about old writers continuing to win awards and new writers coming onto the scene, and the continuing evolution of science fiction scholarship, which in this period did a quantum jump in the late 70s and into the 80s. And then I'm going to highlight some key writers of the 1980s: David Brin, Orson Scott Card, John Varley, Douglas Adams, and Gene Wolfe. And that's about as far as we'll get today. That'll be the end of part one of this two-part webinar. When we get back together in the second half, I'm going to be talking about noteworthy women science fiction writers who emerged in the post-Star Wars era. Vonda McIntyre, Joan Vinci, Margaret Atwood, and C.J. Sherry. And then we'll get into a bit about what was going on in terms of the evolution of technology in the late 70s and into the 80s, because that's going to have a significant impact on science fiction, in particular the emergence of cyberpunk. And we'll talk about what cyberpunk is and what cyberspace is, and why cyberspace was a philosophical and ontological invention, was something that was a totally different universe to move into. And I'm going to highlight some of the key cyberpunk authors like William Gibson and Bruce Sterling and Rudy Rucker, and then some other cyberpunk hero writers. And I'll close out my treatment of cyberpunk with Neil Stephenson and Snow Crash and the Diamond Age. And the Diamond Age actually was written in the 1990s, but I thought it was appropriate to include it together with Snow Crash, since they are really two fantastic, great novels of the era. And the Diamond Age brings to fruition lots of things that were going on in science fiction up to that point. I'm also going to talk about science fiction art and the technology of art, because that's a big feature of the evolution of science fiction during this 13-year period. and we're going to highlight certain science fiction artists, one of whom we will talk about, we'll start talking about even today, Geiger or Giger, depending on how you want to pronounce him, in his creation of Alien, and the significance of that in the evolution of science fiction. Then we'll do some summary questions at the end. So that's sort of an overview of what we're going to be doing today and we're going to be doing next time. So let's go back to Thomas Disch and The Dreams Our Stuff Is Made Of, How Science Fiction Conquered the World. And I have up here a quote from John Clute, who we will get into today as one of the great science fiction scholars. Everything else is looking more like science fiction, and science fiction is looking more like everything else. Now, when Thomas Disch wrote this book, published it in 1999, now this is 20 years after the period I'm discussing, Thomas Disch won the Hugo for this novel as best related book. It's a nonfiction book. Thomas Disch was a very accomplished science fiction writer who wrote quite a number of really superb novels back in the 1960s and 70s. And then he wrote this historical scholarly book on the evolution of science fiction. The title, The Dreams Our Stuff Is Made Of, is a play on a line out of Shakespeare's The Tempest, spoken by Prospero. And the line is, "We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep." And what Shakespeare, through the mouth of Prospero, was getting at through those lines is that the world that we live in, the world of wakefulness, the material world around us, is but a dreamlike reality, fleeting and insubstantial. And Disch took that expression and flipped it around and instead said, the dreams our stuff is made of, meaning the stuff around us, our physical world, our waking world, is actually built up out of our dreams. And what he meant by that is that the modern world is a creation, a consequence, a product of the fantasies and imaginations of science fiction. That our fantasies, our imagination is what has built this world around us. And what he argues through that book, and it's a historical book, going back to the beginnings of science fiction, is that what we see around us today, a good deal of it was stimulated, provoked into invention and creation by the images that were created within science fiction. That science fiction writers, in a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, anticipated things about the future and stimulated people into actually creating those things. And so what we see around us is like a consequence of images created in science fiction. And in fact, Disch is making a very basic point about human reality, that human reality, that our everyday human reality is human invention. It's creations of our imagination. And it is in the world of fantasy that we think about what might be, what could be. And from thinking about what might be, what could be, what hypotheticals there are, that's the material out of which, the inspirations out of which we actually have built our world. So Disch puts his focus on that basic phenomena that he's observed throughout human history, that science fiction invents, stimulates, inspires, And then from that, we end up making the world out of those dreams, out of those fantasies. But I like the expression how science fiction conquered the world because it's rather contentious. I had somebody write to me and said that's too military a vision of science fiction, conquering, and we shouldn't think about conquering anything, and that we should have more of a philosophy of collaboration, cooperation. We shouldn't think something's being conquered, blah, blah, blah. But indeed, I would suggest that in an interest of being provocative and stimulating on this, is that through science fiction cinema and art and graphics and media and technology immersion and gadgetry and the commercialization of science fiction in the 70s and 80s and cultural icons and gadgetry and toys and numerous popular subcultures, of which there were many. Science fiction permeated out into our everyday world and took control over the nature and evolution of where our world is heading. That is, science fiction provided the ideas and philosophy and experiences and visualizations that definitely had this tremendous impact upon popular culture. And this is interesting because this is in fact what New Wave was trying to do 15 years earlier and never quite succeeded at it. But in the late 70s and into the 80s, it definitely did occur that the creations of science fiction conquered the world, conquered our consciousness, conquered our culture. And that the territories covered in science fiction kept stretching outward and diversifying and began to look more and more like general fiction in a lot of ways. So the interesting thing here is that this very powerful impact that science fiction had upon popular culture was stimulated or instigated through, of all things, the movies to begin with, science fiction cinema, and in particular, a certain kind of science fiction cinema to begin with. That is a resurrection of the space opera. And the space opera, as you recall, is a form of science fiction that goes back to the 1930s and 40s with Doc Smith and Edmund Hamilton, who created these tremendous space adventures with great battles and giant spaceships and all kinds of different aliens. And this is 1930s, 1940s science fiction. And when science fiction cinema became so immensely popular in the late 70s and the 80s, it became popular through space opera type cinematic productions. They were epical and became blockbusters, became the biggest money-making movies of all time. And it created multiple universes and subcultures. In fact, the word expression I use here for the overall impact and reality of this form of science fiction cinema was visual spectacularism, because the movies that came out in the 70s and into the 80s far exceeded anything before in terms of their visual power. Up here we have an image from The Empire Strikes Back, one of the Star Wars movies. Now, the three movies to begin with that were of this nature, this space opera epical blockbuster nature that started it all, were in fact the first three Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi. But even though these were very popular and were the instigators, they weren't the only movies of that era that had this kind of formula of space opera, blockbuster, epical series. Different people have different views on which of the first three was the best, but a lot of us became addicted to watching these things, much more so than ever before. And in fact, I recall as a young adult and keeping count of it, I went to see in a theater the first Star Wars 11 times in a period of about a month and a half. I just could not get away from having to go back and watch it again. It so stimulated my emotions and my thinking. I just had to keep going back and watching it over and over again. A lot of people think The Empire Strikes Back was the best of the three. Actually, I think maybe Return of the Jedi was, but whichever of the three you pick, a thing to note is that these three movies, as science fiction movies, were among the top 5 or 6 highest grossing films of the 1970s and 80s. These made more money than any other series of movies ever produced. But as I said, they weren't the only ones. In fact, right hot on the heels of the Star Wars series, which now is up to what, 10, 11 movies in the whole series when we come up to the present, we had a second space opera series emerge, piggybacking on Star Wars, but also piggybacking on the TV series of Star Trek. Oh, excuse me. A series of Star Trek movies came out in the late 1970s and into the 1980s with the original cast from the TV series. People will usually say that they think The Wrath of Khan was the best of the first few. I like more The Voyage Home, where not the Enterprise, but the Star Trek crew travels back to contemporary San Francisco in a Klingon spaceship. But these movies also, not as big as Star Wars, became big money-making movies of the time as well. And the Star Wars and Star Trek series have continued up through present times. They keep making more Star Wars, they keep making more Star Treks. And they actually created 2 different universes of different characters, different histories, different good guys, different bad guys. They created subcultures in popular culture. There are Star Trek conventions which have been ongoing. Star Wars, as far as I'm aware, does not have its own separate conventions, but there's a whole Star Wars community of people who are fascinated and interested in the whole saga. And both of them, of course, led to incredible commercialization, big money-making operations, both of them. Now, just as some points to summarize about these kinds of movies that started up in the late 1970s, these science fiction movies. They were spectacular, much more visually spectacular than anything that had ever been put up on the screen before, except perhaps 2001. And even there, 2001 looks rather primitive in comparison to what they were able to produce into the late 70s and early 80s. There was immense sensory immersion and engulfment. We were really drawn into the scenes, the outer space battles, the alien terrains that were created in these movies. As I mentioned, they were blockbusters. They became the most popular movies of all time. In fact, Adam Roberts, who's an historian of science fiction, has argued that beginning with Star Wars, the dominant mode of science fiction moved from literature to the cinema. That is, the visual took precedence over the literary in the science fiction experience. How many people read science fiction novels, science fiction stories? I'm sure there's quite a large number. But if you compare it to how many people have seen science fiction movies, there's no comparison at all. Most people's encounters with science fiction have come through science fiction cinema. And that definitely was ignited in the late 70s and into the 1980s, where science fiction ended up for sure conquering the world of cinema. We even have musical icons too, like John Williams, who did the music for a number of the big science fiction movies of the time. And science fiction also, according to Adam Roberts, colonized popular art. If you look at popular art today, popular art has lots of science fiction elements in it. It, of course, was facilitated by the ongoing evolution of special effects technology, but science fiction cinema and art actually further stimulated the evolution of computer graphics technology. It was a feedback loop. And as I mentioned, there were multiple subcultures, and I'll mention some more in a moment. There was Star Trek, there was Star Wars, multiple universes. Now, Star Wars has often been criticized as juvenile and derivative of simply good versus evil, with a mystical dimension in it. That is, there's wizards who have mystical powers in the middle of scientifically informed universes, especially in Star Wars. And even if Star Wars is supposed to be taking place in a galaxy far, far away, a long, long time ago, it's actually a romanticized image of a kind of space opera image of the future. It has a futuristic quality to it. And comparing it back to Golden Age science fiction as being its inspiration, you could say that Star Wars, Star Trek, and other ones like it were actually regressive in terms of their themes, their intelligence, their fundamental narrative structure. The new wave attempted to evolve beyond the Golden Age. Star Trek and Star Wars go back to the Golden Age again. And so it's fascinating that science fiction, which looks to the future, had this tremendous impact on popular culture, but it had it by framing itself in terms of the kind of science fiction that was actually written 30 years previous, 40 years previous to it. Now, let me just stop for 30 seconds before I go to this next slide. I just have to get my clock so I could watch where I am in the process. I'll be right back. Okay, thank you. I didn't want to have too many notes. All right, so here we have an image from one of the other blockbuster science fiction movies of the late 70s, the image of the alien from Close Encounters. And I'm going to put up here on this slide some of the biggest money-making, most viewed science fiction movies of this 13-year period. Close Encounters, which came out the same year as the first Star Wars in 1977, was created by Steven Spielberg. And I should mention at this point that two of the central architects of this new blockbuster, visually spectacular form of science fiction were George Lucas from Star Wars and Steven Spielberg. And Steven Spielberg did Close Encounters, but a few years later, he would even exceed in popularity another science fiction movie that he made, which I'll come to in a moment. You may wonder why I put Batman up there as science fiction, but Batman, in fact, is science fiction. It has lots of technological innovation in it, and it is a superhero who has been technologically in various ways enhanced or augmented. And it is one of the early examples of what would come to be a very popular form of science fiction cinema in the last couple of decades, which is the superhero form of science fiction. What made the original Batman of this is 1989 with Michael Keaton. What really made this Batman a very fascinating movie wasn't Michael Keaton, it was Jack Nicholson playing the Joker. And a thing that frequently occurs in science fiction cinema is that the villain turns out to be more interesting than the hero. Like Darth Vader is vastly more interesting than Luke Skywalker, vastly more interesting as a character. And Jack Nicholson as the Joker steals this movie. He's, of course, Jack Nicholson's an incredible actor, but the makeup and the narrative, the mannerisms, the whole thing, Jack Nicholson comes off as a riveting and powerful and fascinating, perverse human being. Close Encounters, which is a totally different kind of movie from Batman, involves super powerful, intelligent aliens making contact with us and opening up this incredible world of wonder. I went to see Close Encounters not quite as many times as Star Wars, but I did see it quite a few times. And one of my science fiction friends, Edward Bryant, who's a science fiction writer, I went to see it one day with him because Close Encounters, they kept redoing it. And Ed told me that he has to go see every science fiction movie ever made because he considers it part of his professional responsibility. And I remember going to see one of the later versions of Close Encounters with Ed, where they first put in the scenes from inside of the alien spaceship, where it looks like a giant Christmas tree. And you should watch some of the different versions of Close Encounters. But the spaceship in Close Encounters, the mothership, was one of the most significant examples of visual spectacularism put up on the screen. Then when that ship emerges from behind Devil's Tower, it just blows you away, the immensity and the brilliance of it. But we end up making contact with benevolent and advanced aliens in this movie, and we don't always end up making contact with those kinds of aliens in other movies to come. But these were two of the biggest selling movies of the 1970s and 80s, Batman and Close Encounters. Now, two other ones that were also in top 10 lists of biggest money-making movies of this era were also science fiction, were time travel, and on top of it all were comedies, an interesting twist, were Back to the Future, and then Back to the Future 2, and of course there was a Back to the Future 3. And it's an important thing to note here that these were not intended as so much serious movies or mind-stretching movies as interesting comical takes on time travel and the puzzles and paradoxes you can get into with time travel if you go back and you meet your mother and your mother is sexually attracted to you in the opening one. And these are thoroughly enjoyable movies that people just basically all loved. And of course, they were, as I mentioned, two of the biggest money-making movies of their era. Now, next to Star Wars, in the 1970s, the biggest money-making movie of the whole decade was Superman. And Superman, of course, is a golden age superhero created back in the 1930s, came into dominance in the comics toward the end of the 1930s, and we didn't have the technology in cinema to create a really believable flying man till we come up to the 1970s. And we finally do with the 1978, 1977 version of Superman. And Superman, of course, you could have a debate about whether it's science fiction, but of course it is science fiction because it's about an alien with superpowers that comes to Earth. And of course, this alien, in this case here, being a good guy, has to fight against bad guys, including other aliens from his own planet, which come up in Superman 2. But if you look at the plots in those movies, the plots in those movies are basically simplistic good guy versus bad guy, but we have this amazingly spectacular superhero that emerges on the scene. And just like Batman during the same period of time, these are the beginnings of the superhero phenomena, which would actually come to dominate science fiction cinema as we go through the coming decades. Now, for a totally different kind of science fiction movie, also among the most popular movies of the time, were the Alien series. Now, again, keep in mind that all of these movies, except for Close Encounters, spawn many sequences to them. And so Alien now, I think, is up to 6 or 7 movies at least. But the original Alien, which came out in 1979, was a movie that created up on the screen, I think, the most hideous and unnerving science fiction monster ever produced in the cinema. The fascinating thing about Alien is that Alien originally was a serious work of art created by H.R. Giger, who was an artist in Central Europe, Germany, Austria, somewhere around there. And it was a creature he created in one of his very dark and perverse and bizarre paintings. And they took that image and they turned it into a movie. And Giger did a lot of the work on the first Alien. And the first Alien has in it one of the most memorable scenes ever in a science fiction movie, where the little alien pops out of William Hurt's belly on the dining room table and goes scurrying off. A hideous scene, an incredibly surprising scene, and a very memorable scene. Another thing about Alien is that Giger mixed in his art the biological and the mechanical, where you got this very bizarre twisting and turning and serpentine kind of visualization of machine and life meshed together. And if you go look at a lot of Giger's art, you see this repeatedly happening, where he is able to take the machine and take the biological and twist them into these very unnerving forms. And so the spaceship in Alien is very noticeable too. It's a different kind of spaceship from the kind you see in Star Wars. And the scenes are very dark. It's a nightmare. It's a movie that gave lots of people nightmares. It's very tense. And when we come to Aliens, the second one, I think the second one is actually even better than the first one. We get a further evolution where now we have a mother alien who lays these eggs and gives birth to lots of offspring. And we have 24th century Marines who are very interested in that too. But we also see here that in these movies, the central protagonist, the tough character, is a woman, Sigourney Weaver, or Lieutenant Ripley. And so we have this emergence in the late 70s into the 80s of a very admirable and ethically good, but very good in battle, female as the central character. And Aliens, as I said, would go on through like 6 or 7 different movies in the next few decades. And in my mind, it was Alien is the epitome of an alien monster-like creature created in science fiction. Some kind of cross between a dragon, a reptile, a machine with detachable jaws, a detachable second set of teeth that, you know, pulverize human flesh and any other kind of flesh. So very, very hideous, very, very scary, very, very dark, and very, very good. Much better than any kind of monster movie I think ever made before in science fiction. But the most popular science fiction movie of this era, in terms of gross sales and views, probably only equaled by the original Star Wars, was Steven Spielberg's creation of E.T. And E.T. is very simple. It's with a little boy who makes friends with an alien. And the alien starts to get sick because it's not back in its homeland. And people just were drawn emotionally into E.T., and E.T. became the biggest money-making movie of the 1980s. And so if Star Wars hadn't cemented science fiction's hold on the cinema, E.T. definitely did. E.T. came out, I think, in 1980, 1981, somewhere around there, and immensely popular all over the world. And people were very sympathetic with E.T. He was a sympathetic alien, much different than the aliens in the movie Alien. And it was with a family and a little boy who befriends the alien. And so that touched people and touched families. It was a family science fiction movie. So science fiction got into the family, got into families going and watching it. And if you didn't like the high-tech kind of science fiction, the outer space science fiction, here was a humanistic story involving human heart and friendship. And so E.T., as the early 1980s, became, along with Star Wars, the biggest of the super blockbuster science fiction movies, without a lot of big special effects in it, more of a human story. But this is only the beginning of things that were going on in science fiction cinema. Arnold Schwarzenegger comes on the scene. And Arnold Schwarzenegger had first made his mark in cinema in the Conan movie, but then he came into his own with Terminator and then Predator. And Terminator and Predator both have very memorable evil villainous characters. Schwarzenegger plays the Terminator in the first Terminator. Schwarzenegger fights against the great adversary in Predator, eventually winning at the end. Predator, in some ways, I found a more interesting movie because it takes a very simple little idea, a twist, which is given the fact that we've always hunted animals. What if somebody came to Earth wanting to hunt us? And the Predator in this movie, the Alien, is a very fascinating, imaginative, and hideous creation too. And the whole thing takes place in Central America, I think, jungles. And so the Terminator and Predator would both spawn numerous sequels. They both involve very muscular, macho protagonists with super villains. In one case, the villain is the macho character Schwarzenegger. As everybody knows, Schwarzenegger in the second Terminator and thereafter becomes a good Terminator as opposed to a bad one. But both of these movies also were extremely popular during that era and did very well. And Schwarzenegger was connected with them both. And they both spawned series. Note here again how these movies keep spawning series and create a whole storyline of different characters and subplots, and people become fans of each of these series and the universe is being created in them. Another series that emerged during this time was Mel Gibson with Mad Max. And even though Mel Gibson has not played Mad Max in the most recent version of Mad Max Fury Road, Mel Gibson was the main character in a few of them, 3 or 4 of them, to begin with back in the 1980s. And Mad Max introduces a theme that repeatedly comes up in both science fiction literature and often in science fiction cinema, which is the bleak post-apocalyptic future in which civilization has been destroyed. We have lone heroic characters who are trying to struggle and survive in a world that's been obliterated for whatever the reason happens to be. And Mad Max became a very popular series that emerged during that time too. And Mad Max was in fact, although in some ways a decent soul, definitely participating in an awful lot of violence throughout each of the movies. Now, here's an image from the movie Light Years, which in case you haven't seen it, and it came out in the 1990s, no, excuse me, I didn't mean to say 1990s. It came out in the 1980s and was based on a French movie that was created the previous year. Light Years is a very fascinating cartoon science fiction movie of the era, with time travel and time paradoxes and beautiful, strange scenes, and was produced by the same French individual who did Fantastic Planet, which I had mentioned back in the previous webinar. So in case you haven't seen Light Years or haven't seen Fantastic Planet, these are both very intelligent, very strange and imaginative science fiction cartoons that were made back during that time. But I'm just putting up here a number of other popular science fiction movies that I thought were very good, favorites of mine during the late 70s into the 80s. Altered States, where we have a machine that allows one to go back, evolutionary regress. The 1980s version of The Fly, which I found much better than the original version with Vincent Price. The cyborg RoboCop, that's a combination of an external technoskeleton and a flesh and blood internal body. I don't know how much of RoboCop's body survived, actually. Enemy Mine, which was based on a science fiction story. Brainwave, in which we have another kind of psychological consciousness science fiction story where we see heaven and God. Tron, which I had mentioned. Another cartoon, 2 other cartoons that came out, cartoon movies, Wizards and Akira. And Akira was produced in Japan, and Akira has definite cyberpunk qualities to it, with a motorcycle gang and an urban setting and a punk quality, where the motorcycle gang are the central characters. And The Abyss, which was a movie involving both love and a crazy Marine, as well as aliens who live under the ocean, and time travel, where Christopher Reeve, who played Superman, now plays a time traveler in love with Jane Seymour. Very touching movie. And Starman, which was a very good low-key psychological study of an alien getting stranded on the Earth. These are some of my other favorites of that time. But in fact, the list just goes on. It goes on and on of science fiction movies produced during this 12-year period. In fact, I don't think I mentioned it already, but more science fiction movies were produced during this 12 years than ever before. This is a scene from Escape from New York, which is a very gritty pretty good science fiction movie of the time. But I just want to mention at the beginning here of this slide, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, which is dorky and stupid and was one of the 20 biggest money-making movies of the 1980s or 70s, I forget which. Very, very popular. The 1980s, that's what it was, the 1980s. And Spaceballs and Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. So science fiction cinema kept producing comedies as well as more serious movies with terrible monsters and big battle scenes, etc. There was science fiction comedies being produced. And as everybody knows, Spaceballs was a spoof on Star Wars, produced by Mel Brooks. And so we had science fiction comedies produced in the 70s and 80s. And here's some other ones I just threw up here, which I thought were very good or pretty good at the time. Millennium, based on a novel by John Varley, I'll come back to. Time After Time, where H.G. Wells goes in a time machine in search of Jack the Ripper. Cherry 2000 with Melanie Griffith, where the question is raised, is a flesh and blood woman better than a robot? Another redo of Who Goes There, this time John Carpenter's The Thing, which is closer to the original plot. Cocoon, another comical movie of that time, The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai. So there was a whole slew of additional fairly high quality science fiction movies that were produced in the 1970s and 80s. At the break, we may put up a list for you in case you want to have a look at it. It's just my list of compiling together the science fiction movies of that era. And I'm only highlighting here a small number of the ones I think are good. But what I haven't done at this point, and this is the point I'll come to as a concluding slide for the first half of this presentation, what did I think, irrespective of how much money they made and how popular they were, what did I think were the best science fiction movies of this era? And this is my pick. Now, you may think something different and we can discuss this, but here's my pick of the two best science fiction movies of this era. And I haven't even mentioned them yet. And there's an image from one. Perhaps you recognize it. And here's an image of the other. And the two best, I would say, of the era were Blade Runner and Brazil. Some people might not think of Brazil, in case you've seen it, some people haven't seen it, as science fiction, but it's a alternate quasi-futuristic bureaucratic reality that's filled with a lot of fantastical imagery and is partially dreamlike, a mixing together of fantasy and reality, and containing a whole host of different inventive ideas, and produced by Terry Gilliam, who was a member of Monty Python. And in fact, Gilliam would go on to produce other very good science fiction movies in the coming decades. Brazil is another one of those movies I could see over and over again. And if you haven't seen it, the only thing I can say is go watch it, because to describe it is to miss the strange, inventive nature of this movie in terms of words, trying to put it into words. Of course, lots of people love the original Blade Runner, and so I'm probably in agreement with people over this being one of the best, if not at the top of the list of science fiction cinema of that era. And Blade Runner is highly cyberpunk. That's the interesting thing about it, because it takes place in a future reality, which is dark and depressing, which has androids in it, is controlled by powers that are rather mysterious, where the world is taking this twist and turn into something that is like a 1940s a mystery novel. And we have a hunter in here who is out to assassinate replicants until he falls in love with one of them, played by Sean Young. And it has one of the most memorable philosophical scenes, or two of them, in science fiction cinema, where the leader of the replicants confronts his creator and kills him, as if man killing God. And also when that replicant at the end dies and releases out of his embrace a white dove which sails up into the rainy sky. Both of these movies are visually spectacular, probably not as spectacular as Star Wars, but I think have a lot more substance to them and are very inventive in lots of ways in which perhaps Star Wars wasn't. And so covering this 12, 13-year period, a lot went on in science fiction cinema. Not quite as much went on if we were to look at science fiction TV of the era. And I will mention, though, that of significance, Star Trek was resurrected. The Next Generation came in the 1980s with a whole new crew. And so Star Trek kept going on TV. And in fact, Star Trek has kept going on TV up to the present time. The Star Trek universe has become extremely complex on TV, let alone in the movies. I don't know how many movies there have been, but there's been well over a half a dozen different Star Trek TV shows. The second one being with Captain Picard and Lieutenant Riker and Lieutenant Worf and Data, who was a new interesting version of the synthesis of machine and the biological. Excuse me. And there were other, TV series of that era too. Battlestar Galactica, which was an imitation of Star Wars, wasn't so good. The one back in the 1970s, 80s. Boom, they redid it 20 years later. I think it became much, much better. But also during that time, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy emerged on British TV. And we'll come back to The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy when we talk about novels of the era and authors of the era. But science fiction cinema was spectacular, inventive, interesting. Science fiction TV was not of anything of consequence. Of course, there's the $6 Million Man and the Bionic Woman, but nothing really stands out that much, except for Star Trek: The Next Generation as a continuation of the Star Trek universe. So at that point, why don't we take a little break here? I will stop sharing. Okay, probably got comments up there. Okay, yeah, lots of comments. Why don't we? Okay, so we're set, and here we go with the rest of our webinar today. We had left off with science fiction TV and Star Trek: The Next Generation, et cetera, et cetera. So now let's move over into the social and literary aspects of science fiction in the late 70s and into the 1980s. Actually, I have up here another quote from John Clute. Science fiction's past is increasingly becoming a set of myths to be retold, which connects in a bit with what Hank was saying in this sense here, that science fiction is building a history of basic narratives and themes which get rewritten about and retold and revisualized. In fact, another quote from John Clute, and I'll mention about John Clute in a little more depth in a moment, I don't have up on the screen, is the slow transformation of science fiction into an archive of futures past, into a vast library, keeps more of its past works in print than any other fictional genre. And in fact, science fiction is indeed this historical record that's very closely attended to by science fiction readers and fans of numerous types of narratives and stories that keep building on themselves that are mythic in quality. It's acquired this deep history to it. And they keep getting reworked. Now, in the 1970s and into the 1980s, aside from the fact that we had more science fiction movies produced than ever before, we had this increasing number of science fiction conventions, increasing attendance at science fiction conventions, and more different science fiction awards. And I have up on the screen here some images that are going to relate or connect with what I'm about to say. Back in the early 70s, the British got into it and came up with the British Science Fiction Award to go along with the Hugo and the Nebula. There was another one that began in the 1970s, the John Campbell Memorial Award, which I'll come back to, which was for the best science fiction novel of the year. And in 1973, they came up with the John Campbell Astounding Award for Best New Writer in Science Fiction. The Arthur C. Clarke Award for Science Fiction Literature started up in the 80s. And the Philip Dick Award started up in the 80s. The World Fantasy Award, comparable to the World Science Fiction Awards, started up in the mid-70s. And notice the image there. Originally, the trophy that was given out for the World Fantasy Award was a statue of H.P. Lovecraft. It eventually was changed to a tree with like a moon or a sun behind it. But Lovecraft had been the icon for fantasy, although I described Lovecraft earlier as science fiction. The Locus Awards, which are voted on by readers of Locus, started up in the 1970s too. The James Tiptree Award, after James Tiptree, started up actually in the 1990s. The Science Fiction Grand Master Award, that they only give out to one person a year, started up in 1975. And the Science Fiction and Fantasy Hall of Fame actually didn't start up until the mid-1990s, but was another significant way in which science fiction would honor its writers and people who contributed into the evolving genre. So we have lots of different awards. We have lots of different authors and stories and novels being recognized, and more all the time. And in case you're interested, Locus Magazine, that I have a couple images up on the screen up, is a good monthly magazine to subscribe to read about what the newest stuff is coming out in science fiction. And Locus Magazine has been doing that for decades and decades and decades. And so if you want a summary of the best new stories, the best new novels, subscribe to Locus Magazine. And they're always looking for new subscribers since they operate on a shoestring somewhere out of Oakland, California. But it's a kind of ongoing, in-depth review of contemporary science fiction. And, you know, I had mentioned earlier, aside from the annual World Science Fiction Conventions, there's numerous Star Trek conventions that go on. So there's lots of different subcultures, subgroups that have their awards, that have their icons. And this is part of the overall cultural phenomena of the whole thing, and records being kept of the whole thing, and books staying in print, and authors being recognized. Now, one award in particular which has been one of the most coveted science fiction awards, is the Hugo. And the Hugo actually began in 1953, if I recall correctly. And when short fiction began winning awards at the beginning of the first year, if I'm not mistaken, they didn't have awards for short fiction. The Demolished Man won for Best Novel in '53, but then they started giving awards for short fiction in 1955. And Isaac Asimov, as the editor of the series, the Hugo Awards for short fiction were published as anthologies, with him providing general introductory comical comments about the writers and the stories and himself, and to get a sense of the short science fiction that won that was acknowledged as the best of the year. Reading the Hugo winners through the first 6 volumes edited by Isaac Asimov, the 7th and the 8th books up there were not edited by him because he had died in 1992, I think. But this gives you a good flavor for the ongoing historical continuity and evolution and development of science fiction through the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and into the 90s. And as I mentioned before, even though I might highlight a writer for a particular decade, many of the best science fiction writers were prolific and popular through multiple decades, continuing to write long past when they hit their peak, including Isaac Asimov, for that matter, who was writing back in the golden age in the 1940s and continued to write science fiction up into the 70s and 80s. And as an intro into the science fiction literature of the period of 1977 to 1990, the period I'm covering right now, I just wanted to highlight some of the writers who we've already talked about who continue to write and continue to write very good things and won Hugos for Best Short Story, Best Novella, Best Novelette of the Year. And a good place to begin is, in fact, with Isaac Asimov. Isaac Asimov, during this period, won the Hugo twice for The Bicentennial Man and Gold. And The Bicentennial Man actually is a very engaging, interesting story about a robot who wants to become a man. They eventually made this into a movie, and I'm not sure when it was, in the 1990s. The movie was made, Okay, 1999. Okay, just wanted to look at my notes. But it was an excellent novella, very touching, very moving. And in the end, the choice is for the robot: do I want to have all of these incredible powers, incredible abilities, but not be considered equal to a human being? And in order to be considered equal to a human being, do I have to sacrifice my immortality? And so it becomes a rather philosophical story at the end, but it's a very good piece of work that he wrote in 1976 during this period that I'm talking about, and won the Hugo that year. Another writer who I already introduced back from earlier times, Poul Anderson. Poul Anderson, in fact, won Hugos and Nebulas on at least a dozen, if not more, occasions for his novels and his stories. He came on the scene in the early 1950s, a little bit later than Isaac Asimov, but kept writing into the 1980s, and I think even into the 1990s, and won 2 Hugos for 2 of his shorter pieces of work in this period, Hunter's Moon and the Saturn Game. The Saturn Game is an interesting story, came out in 81, about a group of astronauts who have trouble distinguishing between a fantasy realm that they participate in, which is kind of quasi like a video Dungeons and Dragons game, and having to explore one of the moons of Saturn, a moon that has a very strange and bizarre terrain, Apis, which is half frozen ice. And it's an interesting mixture of a fantasy novel, which is their fantasy play, mixed together with hard science fiction. And Poul Anderson remained popular, for 40 years in science fiction, into this period after beginning in the early 1950s. Roger Zelazny of the New Wave era continued to be popular into the 70s and 80s and won the Hugo 3 times for Unicorn Variations, 24 Views of Mount Fuji by Hokusai, if I'm pronouncing that correct, that isn't how to pronounce it, in Permafrost. Permafrost is a very interesting story about a conflict, in a sense, between Gaia, the Earth goddess, and an AI which has control over the entire planet. It's a very fascinating mixture of naturalistic green philosophy with high-tech world brain philosophy. Permafrost, definitely good. And Zelazny, continued to write from the 60s into the 70s and 80s and continued to win awards. Robert Silverberg, who came on the scene back in the 1950s, became one of the big writers of the New Wave, continued to win awards into the 1980s. And as I was researching stories written during this period and read a bunch of new ones, one of the ones I read new that I never read before by Silverberg was Gilgamesh in the Outback. And this story, of all the stories that I was looking at that I hadn't read before, this was the one that impressed me the most. It impressed me the most because Silverberg's a great writer. Silverberg's very imaginative. And Gilgamesh in the Outback takes place in hell. And the central character in it is Gilgamesh, who is the original archetypal kind of superhero individual, an invention of Mesopotamian mythology, perhaps real. And Gilgamesh finds himself in hell. And who does he meet as he's wandering around through hell but H.P. Lovecraft and Robert Howard, who created Conan the Barbarian. And before all is said and done, Ernest Hemingway comes on the scene, Mao Zedong comes on the scene, and Albert Schweitzer and Johannes Bach come on the scene. And we have this kind of alternate, strange reality with various mythic characters of the past living in hell with an adventure going on and apparently being immortal, because if you die in hell, you're just brought back to life again. Now, whether this is science fiction or fantasy or a mixture of the two is rather debatable. But going back to the comment about nothing ever happens in heaven, well, on the other hand, an awful lot happens in hell, at least in the hell that Gilgamesh is participating in. And so I would highly recommend that. And by the way, all of these are in that series, the Hugo winners. Joel Haldeman, who wrote The Forever War, continued to write science fiction. Tricentennial is a very good story that he wrote back in this time about a spaceship that goes off looking for an Earth-like world and gets locked into an acceleration of speed and ends up 5,000 years into the future, and the Earth falls apart in the meantime. Very good story, interesting. And then finally, Ursula Gwen, who had come on the scene during the New Age period, won Hugos in the 70s and 80s, and she won a Hugo for Buffalo Gals Won't You Come Out Tonight, which I found rather fascinating because it's a story about a girl who ends up communicating with and interacting with humans who are actually various animals in kind of disguise, an imaginative disguise. And she becomes friends with a coyote. It's a very fascinating story. I don't know exactly if you call it science fiction, but it did win the Hugo. Now, these are established science fiction writers who continued to write during this period. But in this period, there were new writers that started winning Hugos, and they also wrote novels as well. And I'm not going to talk about them in this webinar. I'm going to wait until the next one to talk about them in the 1990s, because that's when they hit their peak. But I should mention that in the 1980s, the following three all started to win Hugo Awards and became popular writers, new ones now, in the 1980s. And they're Greg Bear, Connie Willis, and Octavia Butler. Now, Debbie wants me to talk about Octavia Butler. She keeps reminding me to talk about her. And we're going to talk about Octavia Butler in the 1990s. And I'll talk about Greg Bear and talk about Connie Willis too. And Jeannie really likes Connie Willis. All three of them started to win Hugos in the 1980s, but they hit their peaks. They hit their real stride in the 1990s. So during this time, we have new writers and we have old writers, and we have this ongoing evolution of science fiction, which you can see chronicled in what were awarded best science fiction novels, not novels, but stories and novellas of the year through the 8 volumes of the Hugo winners, which Asimov edited until he died. Now, something else of great significance in the evolution of science fiction, besides the cinema, was occurring in the 1970s and into the 1980s. And that was the level of scholarship about science fiction jumped significantly. And the first thing to point out, in 1979, the first edition of the Encyclopedia of Science Fiction was published, edited by Peter Nichols. And Peter Nichols is the one with the beard on the left side of the screen. And this reference book for science fiction won the first Hugo for a book about science fiction that wasn't science fiction itself. It wasn't a fictional story, but it was a book about science fiction. And it was the first one that won that award. And they kept giving it every year after that. And this book from 1979 up to the present has blossomed and grown immensely. Nichols' associate editor, to begin with, was John Clute, who was the guy on the left with the balding head. And John Clute in the second iteration of the Encyclopedia of Science Fiction became co-editor with Nichols, the two of them. And when they got to doing the third iteration of it, they put it up online. And Nichols eventually died. Clute is still alive. And they were the two premier science fiction scholars of contemporary science fiction of the last 20, 30, 40 years. And the Encyclopedia of Science Fiction is a vast and absolutely essential resource, the central resource to go to online for getting a good overview of books, of authors, of key concepts. It's a multi-million, I forget how many million words in it, and it keeps growing and growing and growing. Jeannie and I had the pleasure of going to John Clute's house and meeting him when we went to London. And John Clute lives in a purple house. And the whole interior of the flat, the house, whatever, is filled with books from floor to ceiling. And John Clute it was difficult to have a conversation with because all he did was perpetually talk. He was very fascinating to meet, and he has actually donated his whole library of science fiction, which is 10 or 20,000 volumes, to the John Clute Library in Telluride, Colorado. So if you want to see John Clute's science fiction collection, you can go there, because John Clute ran out of room in his house for all the science fiction that he had. But the two of them orchestrated this evolution, and this evolution of this great resource. They became the central early figures of science fiction scholarship in the 1970s and into the 1980s. And it has grown into this immense online resource. But also during the same period, another person who is of great significance was James Gunn. And James Gunn was a professor of science fiction at the University of Kansas, of all places. And he became the director and founder of the Center for the Study of Science Fiction in 1982. So that's during this period. And he's the one who started the John Campbell Memorial Award, and he is the one who started the Science Fiction and Fantasy Hall of Fame. And he also started the Theodore Sturgeon Award for Best Short Science Fiction. He published, which is a very good intro book, The Illustrated History of Science Fiction, back in 1977, which won the Locus Award for a book on science fiction, and his series, The Road to Science Fiction, which is 6 volumes, which are selections of various fictional pieces from the history of science fiction, which you can get very good volumes to read pieces of different classic works. In fact, I was only able to read Lucian's True History back from 150 AD because Gunn included it in his early works of science fiction, along with the Myth of Gilgamesh. And so James Gunn turned science fiction into an area of academic scholarship and teaching. And he would have conferences every year at the University of Texas, and he only just recently died. But he was another key figure in the evolution of science fiction scholarship, science fiction education, along with Clute and Nichols, that emerged during this period. So just like the cinema really grew, science fiction scholarship really grew. And indeed, I may have mentioned, or maybe I didn't mention, but during this time, more science fiction novels were produced than ever before. Illustrated histories, besides Gunn's, came out during this time. The Visual Encyclopedia of Science Fiction, the Illustrated History of Science Fiction, very scholarly academic books came out, like The Origins of Futuristic Fiction and Positions and Presuppositions in Science Fiction. A lot of scholarship besides Gunn and Nichols and Clute was being produced. Two very good history scholarly works on science fiction came out during this time. The World Beyond the Hill, which I've mentioned already because of its critique of Stapleton, by Alexei and Corey Panshin, Science Fiction and the Quest for Transcendence. And in fact, this book presents, this book came out in the 80s and it won the Hugo Award in 1990 for Best Related Book on Science Fiction. This book does present a strong argument why science fiction is the mythology of the future. And I didn't even read this book until after I had already independently came up with that idea. But it does present that idea in here, and it's a very good history of science fiction up to the Golden Age, and then it stops. Never completes the history of science fiction, but with a lot of theoretical discussion up till then. A really good reference book, which came out during this decade, Science Fiction, The 100 Best Novels by David Pringle. And Pringle was in fact a science fiction writer who also did non-fictional stuff regarding science fiction. And this book that he did contains summaries of what he thinks are the 100 best science fiction novels from 1948, when 1984 was published, up to 1984. And it ends with Neuromancer. That's as far as he gets. But it's a really good resource, another good piece of scholarship that was done during this time. So science fiction scholarship is definitely accelerating and growing. Finally, Brian Aldiss, who we already mentioned as a science fiction writer of the New Wave, back in 1970 had written a history of science fiction called Billion Year Spree. 15 years later, in the mid-1980s, together with David Wingrove, he wrote Trillion Year Spree, which is a kind of update of the Billion Year Spree book. I've read them both, and the Trillion Year Spree is just a further development, bringing it more up to the presence of Aldiss's vision of the future of, the history of science fiction. And interestingly, Aldiss is another science fiction writer who mixed together both scholarship and science fiction writing. And during the 1980s, this is post New Wave, he produced his masterpiece. And his masterpiece was the Heliconia trilogy. And the Heliconia trilogy takes place 6,000 years in the future. And just to begin, as a point to make, is not only where science fiction, only with science fiction cinema generating these epical series in science fiction literature, beginning in the 1980s, we began to see epical literary series. And Heliconia was one of the first coming out in the early 1980s, which were these massive, and I mean massive, books of fiction. Heliconia being the 3 volumes, like 1,400 pages in length. Now, Doc Smith, when he did the Lensman series, that series was probably 1,200 to 1,500 pages in length. Heliconia was about equal to that. And what we're going to see as we move into the 1980s, for better or worse, is that science fiction novels get bigger in size, and science fiction novels frequently become parts of series that will be written over periods of years. So Heliconia is one to note. 5,000 years in the future, very imaginative, takes place on the planet Heliconia, which is populated by human-like creatures, along with a second intelligent species, which look like minotaurs. Heliconia orbits around 2 suns, one which it orbits once a year, a small year, and the other it orbits every 2,500 years, the big year. And so not only do they have regular seasons, they have these 2,500 year seasons where the entire planet goes through an ice age and then into a tropical era. And the whole thing is being observed and watched by humans in a spaceship that are orbiting it. And the humans are not supposed to interfere with this planet, but the humans are observing it, taking videos of it, and sending the whole thing back to Earth, where it becomes an extremely popular reality TV show back on the Earth. And I'm looking at my clock and I'm at 10 minutes after, and I promised that I would stop about now. And I didn't start to get into the first writers I was going to discuss, beginning with David Brin and Orson Scott Card. But in the interest of time, I think that I will have to quit for right now. Maybe given the amount that's still left for this one, I'm just thinking out loud. For example, even though I didn't want to get into the second half, what was supposed to be the second half for maybe another month, if I wanted to finish up the first half, maybe I could finish up this first half 2 weeks from now, because I do have all of that put together. I'll get back in touch with you on this so we can get up to date. Because in fact, what's happening here with science fiction, which I commented on 3 or 4 times already at least, is as we move through the decades, there's more and more of it. And if you want to do a decent overview of it, my webinars keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. It's sort of like, how much can you cover in a 1.5 to 2 hour period? So maybe I'll stop with all this, a new wave writer who continues into the 80s, is a scholar, writes scholarly stuff, historical stuff, reflecting the increased scholarship, but also writes his masterpiece, which is this epic that's 1,400 pages long, highly imaginative. And it's the first of many such epical series that science fiction writers would get into in the coming decades, as novels went from 250 pages apiece up to 600 and 700 pages apiece. And there's more of them to come for sure. So why don't we just stop sharing right now?